Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee, because today we are going to be discussing the book of 2 Samuel. Hey there, faithful listeners. Thanks for starting out your week the right way by reading some scripture with me as we share a cup of coffee or tea together. I'll be drinking coffee, though. You guys can drink tea if you so choose. Today we're going to be talking about horses, because this portion of 2 Samuel 8 is talking about David and war horses. And contact me and let me know, do you like horses? Have you ever ridden a horse? And do you own a horse? I would like to know those questions today. Let's go ahead and read all of 2 Samuel chapter 8. So grab your cup of coffee and let's jump right into scripture. I'll be reading out of the WEB. After this, David struck the Philistines and subdued them. And David took the bridle of the mother city out of the hand of the Philistines. He struck Moab and measured them with the line, making them to lie down on the ground. And he measured 2 lines to put to death, and 1 full line to keep alive. The Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. David also struck Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, the king of Zobah. As he went to recover his dominion at the river, David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 footmen. David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but reserved of them for 100 chariots. When the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, the king of Zobah, David struck 22,000 men of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. Yahweh gave victory to David wherever he went. David took the shields of gold that were on the servants of Hadadezer, from Beta and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer. King David took great quantity of bronze. When Toi, the king of Hamath, heard that David had struck all the army of Hadadezer, then Toi sent Joram, his son, to King David to greet him and to bless him, because he had fought against Hadadezer and struck him. For Hadadezer had wars with Toi. Joram brought with him vessels of silver, gold, and of bronze. King David also dedicated these to Yahweh, along with the silver and the gold that he dedicated of all the nations which he subdued, of Syria, of Moab, of the children of Ammon, of the Philistines, of Amalek, and all the plunder of Hadadezer, son of Rehob, the king of Zobah. David earned a reputation when he returned from striking down 18,000 men of the Syrians in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all of Edom, he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became servants to David. Yahweh gave great victory to David wherever he went. David reigned over all of Israel, and David executed justice and righteousness for all of his people. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was a recorder. Zodak, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were priests. Zariah was a scribe. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were chief ministers. So all of 2 Samuel 8 is talking about David's numerous victories as the king of Israel. And you can see that David's victories are actually a lot more than Saul's victories were. And Saul did have a lot of victories, but Saul was never really able to get rid of the Philistines and the other nations that were attacking Israel. But David was really beginning to make Israel great. So it says here that the first thing that David did was that he struck the Philistines and subdued them, and David took the bridle of the mother city out of the hand of the Philistines. So don't forget that the Philistines had actually started to encroach in on Israel while Saul was king. In fact, in the battle that Saul died in, the Philistines actually had such a victory in that battle that they were able to literally go into Israel and live in the cities, because the people were so afraid of the Philistines. So the Philistines were really encroaching in on Israel. And so when David becomes king, he immediately nips that in the bud and he starts kicking the Philistines out. So he subdued the Philistines, and it says he took the bridle of the mother city out of the hand of the Philistines, which is just imagery to say that David took back the cities of Israel from the Philistines. And I think The one city that David took back, which is mentioned in First Chronicles, was the city of Gath, where the Philistines had moved in. So after David is finished with the Philistines, it says that he struck Moab. And this is kind of interesting because nobody actually understands why, or really knows why David struck Moab. Because several years before David even became the king, David actually entrusted his family to the Moabites. There was a very short little story in scripture where it says that David took his father and his mother and gave them to the king of Moab so that the king of Moab could take care of them. So a lot of people think that the king of Moab or the Moabite people actually killed David's family, his mom and his dad, because we don't actually know what happened to David's parents. And the last time they're mentioned is when they are in Moab. And I think even Jewish tradition says that the Moabites killed David's parents. So a lot of people think that because the Moabites killed David's family, possibly, David then retaliated against them and really had a great victory over Moab. Although we don't really know if that is actually the case, if the Moabites killed David's family or not. We don't know that, but it could have been any number of reasons. It could have been that Moab was beginning to once again encroach on Israel during the time that Saul was dead and there was some instability in Israel. It could have been that as well. We don't know the reason, but it does say that David had a massive victory over the Moabites. It says that he measured them with the line, making them to lie down on the ground, and he measured 2 lions to put to death and 1 full line to keep alive. So when I was researching this episode, I was looking up information about this because it seemed kind of confusing to me. And a lot of people just think that this means that David parted Moab into 3 different sections and then went in and warred against 2 of those sections and left the 3rd section completely alone. So, David would go in and battle against all of these different cities in Moab, but then he didn't touch the 3rd portion of Moab. And that's because of what it says in the Old Testament law, actually. God was very clear that he did not want Israel to expand their borders. He wanted Israel to just be Israel, to protect their own, to take care of their own, but not to expand their borders. He didn't want Israel to be like a warring state that was constantly trying to gain more and more land and more power. God was very clear about that. And so that is why a lot of people think that David left Moab intact and only forced them to pay tribute to Israel. So basically like a tax to Israel. But after this, it also says that David struck Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, the king of Zobah, as he went to recover his dominion at the river. So as we know, Israel never really took all of their land the way they should have. For many hundreds of years, actually, when God told the Israelites to go into the promised land, he was like, take the land and drive out the people. But Israel never really did that. And so now David has to go down to the river and recover his dominion there because the river was supposed to belong to Israel, the Jordan River. And while he's going to do that, he meets this king there, this king named Hadadezer, and he was the king of Zobah. And apparently this king Hadadezer liked to instigate wars with people. And so King Hadadezer was like, you know what? We're going to go down and try to instigate a battle between us and Israel. So David meets Hadadezer at the river. And it says that David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 footmen. So David had a massive success against this King Hadadezer guy. And then it also says that David hamstrung all the chariot horses except for 100 of them. So apparently King Hadadezer had a bunch of chariot horses, and David crippled all of the horses, also implying that he killed them, except for 100 of them, which he took for himself and for his own armies. And David did this because of what it says in Deuteronomy 17, where it says that a king is not supposed to acquire many war horses for himself. And actually, if you turn to Deuteronomy 17, here's what it says in verse 16. Further, he, or the king, shall not acquire many war horses for himself, nor make the people return to Egypt in order to acquire horses to expand his military power, since the Lord said to you, you shall never return that way again. So I think David was trying to follow the Old Testament law by killing these horses so that he didn't acquire all of them the way it says not to in Deuteronomy 17. However, I have a different opinion about this personally. My opinion is that when it says in Deuteronomy 17 that a king was not to acquire many war horses for himself, the word many actually means multiple if you look at the Hebrew. And multiple means more than one. And so I was thinking about that and I'm like, a king really shouldn't have more than one war horse for himself? And so I was talking to my husband about that because I was kind of confused. And my husband, who's a huge history nerd, was talking to me about how it's very possible that God really did mean that the king should not have more than one war horse. Because if you look throughout history, many of the war horses that you might read about are actually just as famous or even more famous than their own riders. And war horses, as you know, really connect with the person they are riding into battle with. And so if a king had so many of these war horses that he was just switching between several horses, depending on whatever battle he's fighting, he actually might be less successful in that battle than if he just stuck to one horse and constantly rode that one horse through all of his battles. And I found that very interesting. So then today I was going down a rabbit hole while I was reading this passage, and I ended up researching horse heroes throughout history. And it was very interesting. So if you want to research horse heroes throughout history, you'll learn about many of the famous war horses that were just as courageous in battle as their riders were. Going back to Deuteronomy 17, though, it's very possible that God actually did mean that a king was to only have one war horse for himself. Now, this doesn't mean that the king's army couldn't have horses, but the king himself shouldn't have more than one war horse. And that's kind of what it says here. If you read it again in Deuteronomy 17, further, he shall not acquire many war horses for himself, nor make the people return to Egypt in order to acquire war horses to expand his military power. Since the Lord said to him, you shall never return that way again. So to me, this is implying that the king should have only one horse for himself. But I don't think it means that his military can't have horses. But there is a caveat, because Scripture is very clear that a king also wasn't supposed to put his trust in his own military. And so a king wasn't supposed to, be worried about how many weapons he has and how many chariots that he had either, because a king was supposed to put his trust in God. So it is possible that Deuteronomy 17 is talking about both. It's talking about the king should only have one war horse, but also he shouldn't be trying to acquire a ton of horses for his military as well, especially horses from Egypt. And so if we look at what David did in 2 Samuel 8, where he killed many of those horses, but then only took 100 for his military, I think David was really trying to follow the Old Testament law about war horses as best he could, in my opinion. Now, I could be wrong about that. That is personal opinion. So let me know what you guys think regarding war horses. Okay, so after the war horse thing, it says in verse 5 that when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, the king of Zobah, David struck 22,000 men of the Syrians. So I guess the Syrians sided with this king Hadadezer. And then David had a big military success against the Syrians as well. So he put these garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and then the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. So once again, David did not destroy Syria. Instead, he put garrisons in Syria in order to, military bases to watch what the Syrians were doing. And then Syria had to pay taxes to David once again. it says here, and this is repeated twice, that Yahweh gave victory to David wherever he went. So ultimately, all of David's successes were because Yahweh was with him. So David, in order to express gratitude to God, it says that David took the shields of gold that were on the servants of King Hadadezer, and he brought them to Jerusalem. And so basically, it says now that David starts acquiring a lot of gold and silver and bronze in order to specifically dedicate it to God. And also, there's a little story here in verse 9 that this other king named King Toi was very happy that David had defeated this King Hadadezer, because apparently King Toi and King Hadadezer were at war with each other. So King Toi decides to give David all of this bronze and silver and gold. And it says that King David dedicated those to Yahweh as well, along with the silver and gold that he dedicated of all the nations which he subdued, of Syria, of Moab, and the children of Ammon, and the Philistines, and of Amalek, and the plunder of Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, the king of Zobah. So what it means that David was dedicating all of these things to God, it means that David wasn't taking them for himself. Instead, he was giving it back to Yahweh. So that's another way that David, I think, was trying to follow what Deuteronomy 17 says, that the king shall not acquire great amounts of silver and gold for himself. And so David was trying to follow that law from Deuteronomy 17 as well. He was not acquiring great amounts of silver, gold, or bronze for himself. So after this, in verse 13 through 18, it mentions that David had this reputation. He earned a really good reputation as a great warrior of Israel. It says that he struck down 18,000 men of the Syrians in the Valley of Salt. And so now David is like really feared among the nations. And he also put garrisons in Edom, military bases. It says that throughout all of Edom, he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became servants to David. Then once again, it says Yahweh gave victory to David wherever he went. So God was just blessing David with all of this victory as David was going out and making sure that Israel was safe and secure from all of these nations that were trying to destroy it. So in this short little passage, David has subdued the Philistines, the Moabites, the king of Zobah. He's also subdued the Syrians and also the Edomites as well. Then in verse 15 to conclude, it says that David reigned over all of Israel, and David executed justice and righteousness for all of his people. So this just shows that David was a really, really good leader. Not only was he successful in battle, not only was he a man after God's own heart, but he was teaching the people of Israel how to live correctly as well. He was judging them with fairness, it says with justice and with righteousness for all of his people. Then lastly, it mentions all of the different people who had positions of leadership in Israel during the time of David. It says that Joab was over the army. Jehoshaphat was a recorder, meaning he was recording the things that were happening. Zodak and Ahimelech were the priests. It says that Sariah was a scribe. Benaiah was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and that's most likely archers and people who carried slingshots. And then David's sons were chief ministers. So David made his own sons leaders in Israel, and we're going to see how that pans out as David's sons grow older and get more power. It's not going to be pretty. So faithful listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Let me know what you think about the war horses and whether or not kings should have more than one war horse. And if you liked this episode, please share it on your social media platforms and tell people that the Bible Explained podcast exists. Faithful listeners, I will see you all tomorrow for an episode from Romans. Until then, happy listening and God bless.